October 1943. The morning fog drifted low over Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland, wrapping the long rows of captured Axis vehicles in a gray hush. To most men who worked here, this was the heart of America's mechanical war machine, the place where every secret the enemy left behind was taken apart, measured, and understood. Captain Robert Hayes had walked these gravel paths for years, but the small crate being unloaded from the Pacific transport that day stopped him in his tracks. Out rolled something so small it looked like a child's toy beside the hulking German half-tracks and burned-out panzers that usually filled the bay. Sergeant Leo Ramirez whistled low under his breath and wiped a hand across the stenciled characters on its side. Type 95 Kurogane, he read slowly, the syllables foreign and faintly comical to his Texas accent. The vehicle stood chest-high to Hayes, its body narrow, wheels no larger than a dinner plate, 14 inches maybe, and a frame that looked too delicate for war. Ramirez chuckled. "Captain, my neighbor's lawnmower back home's got more guts than this." Hayes grinned. "I've seen lawn tractors with more muscle than this thing." The men laughed, their breath visible in the cold. Engineer Frank Dalton circled it, shaking his head. To them, it was a curiosity, another piece of enemy scrap to dissect and dismiss. Yet something about its condition felt off. The paint was scratched, but not worn. The metal joints were clean, tight. Even the tires, thin as they were, looked almost new. The report that had come with it claimed it had survived 18 months of jungle warfare in New Guinea. That made no sense. Vehicles didn't last that long out there. Not with heat, mud, and insects chewing through rubber. Not with engines that ran day and night on whatever fuel could be scrounged. Hayes flipped through the logbook that came with it. The handwriting was precise, meticulous. Service notes in Japanese columns, dates stretching back to early 1942. Every entry ended the same way. Operational. He frowned, feeling a quiet irritation rise beneath his professional detachment. "All right, let's see what this toy can do," he muttered. Ramirez climbed into the driver's seat, his knees nearly brushing the steering wheel. He looked like a grown man squeezing into a child's pedal car. He pressed the ignition. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the small two-cylinder engine beneath the hood came alive, not with the rough cough of an overworked machine, but with a soft, steady hum. Smooth, even. Hayes felt the vibration through the floor, barely there, more a purr than a growl. The men fell silent. Ramirez tested the throttle. The note rose clean and even, no sputter, no smoke. It was, Hayes thought, like listening to a sewing machine compared to the Jeep's chainsaw roar. He stepped closer, resting one gloved hand on the fender. "That's not what I expected," he said quietly. Dalton nodded, his expression shifting from amusement to curiosity. "Sir, that's precision work. Look at those cooling fins. Perfect spacing. Somebody cared about this thing." Hayes ran a finger along the edge of a bolt head. No tool marks, no rough casting. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure whether to laugh or take notes. Around them, the fog began to thin, sunlight glinting off the metal. In that pale light, the little vehicle no longer looked like a toy. It looked like a challenge. Hayes straightened and glanced toward the test field beyond the bay doors. "Get her ready for a run," he said. Ramirez blinked. "Sir? You're serious?" "Dead serious," Hayes replied. "Let's find out how a 33-horsepower engine survived a war zone when half our Jeeps can't make it through a Maryland mud pit." The men exchanged looks. No one laughed this time. Outside, the sound of distant engines echoed across the proving ground as another day of testing began. But in Bay 3, a different kind of story was about to start. One that would make even the most confident American engineers question what they thought they knew about power, endurance, and the meaning of good design. They had thought it was a joke. They were wrong. Because that small, unassuming machine was about to whisper a lesson across history, one that would outlast every laugh it ever received. What if Japan hadn't built a weaker machine, but a smarter one? In the days that followed, Captain Robert Hayes found himself standing at the crossroads of two industrial worlds. One was the world he knew, Detroit's roaring assembly lines, miles of conveyor belts, riveters pounding out steel with the rhythm of victory. The other was the world of the Pacific, a place of shortages and scarcity where engineers worked in silence with hand tools and salvage. Each nation, he realized, had built not just machines but entire philosophies of war. In America's case, it was a war of abundance. The Willys Jeep had been born from the certainty that America could outbuild anyone. 60 horsepower, 800 pounds of payload, a machine for every task, a vehicle that could serve as ambulance, gun tractor, or scout car. It was fast, muscular, and, above all, replaceable. If one failed, a new one rolled out within hours. Hayes knew this mindset by heart. It was in the way the Jeep growled across concrete, in the way its parts fit together with mechanical confidence. America didn't have to worry about running out. It could afford to think big. But the Japanese engineers who had built the Type 95 hadn't had that luxury. They designed for a world where metal came from recycled cans and gasoline was measured like medicine. When Hayes flipped through the captured technical dossier, he saw the numbers. A 33 horsepower air-cooled engine, 3.5 gallons per 100 miles, half the fuel consumption of the Jeep. 16 tools for full maintenance, no more, no less. He read that line twice. 16 tools. He looked at his own maintenance chart. 147 specialized wrenches, gauges, and pullers needed to service the Willys. He exhaled, half in disbelief, half in admiration. It wasn't just engineering. It was philosophy distilled into steel. They built for isolation, for soldiers who might never see a supply ship again. He thought about the war in China, the endless roads of mud and mountains, the fuel convoys that never came. In that world, a machine didn't need to be powerful. It needed to be immortal. Hayes pinned the Japanese production map to the wall. Tokyo's industrial web looked fragile beside Detroit's. Where America's auto plants sprawled like cities, Japan's factories clustered like villages. Yet somehow, those workshops had produced something that could run through jungles for 18 months straight. He walked across the lab floor to where Ramirez and Dalton were stripping down the engine. Ramirez pointed to the pistons. "Captain, look at this machining. The fit's clean as a whistle. That's not hand-filed, that's skilled precision." Dalton added, "And it's light, air-cooled, no radiator, no water pump. That means fewer parts to break." Hayes nodded, slowly. They didn't build it to perform. They built it to endure. He stepped back, imagining the factories that had birthed both machines, the thunder of American presses against the quiet focus of Japanese workbenches. Two nations fighting the same war, but in two entirely different realities. For one, victory was a matter of how fast you could ship a crate. For the other, it was how long you could keep one running. In that difference lay the entire shape of the Pacific War. The contrast nagged at Hayes. He found himself rereading a translation note scrawled at the bottom of one of the Japanese documents. Vehicle must remain operational for 18 months with only field tools. It wasn't a boast. It was an order. A doctrine written not by dreamers, but by survivors. America's vehicles were built by engineers who could call home for parts. Japan's were built by men who knew no one was coming. That night, long after his crew had gone, Hayes stayed behind in the dim light of the test hangar. The Jeep and the Type 95 sat side by side, two silhouettes under the same roof. One broad and confident, the other small and precise. In their stillness, he saw two visions of power, One born of industrial supremacy, the other of necessity's genius. He thought of the war headlines: production wins wars, America the arsenal of democracy. But what if production wasn't the only kind of strength? What if the truest victory lay in how well something worked when the world around it had fallen apart? Outside, a freight train rumbled by, carrying crates marked Detroit. Hayes watched its lights fade into the mist and wondered how many of those engines, those tanks, those jeeps would still be running a year from now. Then he looked back at the little Japanese machine, silent, waiting, unbroken. Power wasn't everything, he thought. Endurance was. And tomorrow, they would find out which one truly mattered. Dawn arrived over Aberdeen, wrapped in the kind of stillness that only comes before noise. Frost clung to the rails of the testing ground, and the morning sun threw long silver streaks across the mud. Captain Robert Hayes stood with his hands buried in his coat pockets as the mechanics fueled both vehicles side by side. The Willys Jeep on the left, the captured Japanese Type 95 on the right. Behind him, Sergeant Leo Ramirez sipped from a steaming tin mug. "You really think that thing's gonna make it up the grade, Captain?" he asked. Hayes didn't answer. He just watched the vapors curl from the Jeep's exhaust like breath from a boxer before a fight. Engineer Frank Dalton adjusted his clipboard and smiled. "At least we'll get a laugh before breakfast." What followed would silence every laugh on that field. The first test was simple, an incline at 60% grade, designed to mimic the steep ravines of the Pacific Islands. Ramirez climbed into the Jeep, turned the key, and the engine roared to life, loud and confident. The American machine leapt forward, tires clawing at the slope. For a moment it looked unstoppable, but halfway up, the rear wheels spun mud into the air, and the engine strained. The Jeep made it to the crest, but smoke began to leak from under the hood, a thin gray line that spoke of heat building fast. Hayes noted the gauge, 210 degrees Fahrenheit. Too hot, too soon. Ramirez parked at the top, engine idling rough. "She's powerful," he called down, "but she's running angry." Then came the Type 95, smaller, lighter, quieter, its engine barely audible over the wind. Ramirez switched seats with Dalton, who wanted to try it himself. The little Japanese car moved forward without drama. It didn't leap, it climbed. 8 miles an hour steady, the note of its motor constant, unhurried. No smoke, no struggle. Hayes timed it, slower than the Jeep by nearly half, but when it reached the top, the temperature gauge barely moved. 80 degrees below the Jeep's. Dalton stepped out, his face unreadable. "Feels like it's cheating," he said. "Like it knows something we don't." Hayes crouched by the engine bay, listening. The hum was even, calm, like a heartbeat at rest. This wasn't brute strength, it was balance. The next test was traction, soft earth and shallow water, the kind that trapped half of America's equipment in the tropics. The Jeep went first again, charging through the puddle like a bull, spraying mud in every direction. It made it through the first stretch, then bogged down on the second. The wheels spun freely, engine revving, the smell of burning clutch filling the air. The Type 95 rolled in after, its narrow tires cutting thin tracks instead of digging trenches. It didn't roar, it glided, moving through the water with the patience of a machine that had done this before. Hayes marked the pressure readings, 8.2 pounds per square inch of ground contact, nearly a third lighter than the Jeep's. That explained it. Less weight, less drag, more persistence. Ramirez shook his head. "She doesn't roar," he muttered. "She breathes." Hayes looked out across the test field. The American Jeep was everything the country prided itself on. Fast, aggressive, loud. The Japanese machine was the opposite. Quiet, deliberate, economical. Yet here, in the mud and the cold, the quiet one was winning. As the day wore on, they repeated test after test. Hill climbs, river fords, braking, endurance runs. By mid-afternoon, the Jeep had consumed over 6 gallons of fuel. The Type 95 had used barely half that. Hayes studied the notes piling up on his clipboard, each number another piece of a puzzle that refused to fit the way he expected. Every assumption he'd brought to this experiment, about power, design, superiority, was starting to bend. When the sun began to fall behind the distant hangars, he called for one final test. The endurance loop, 100 miles of alternating terrain, the kind of grind that revealed a machine's soul. The Jeep went first. Its engine thundered down the track, strong and familiar. Dust rose in its wake, catching the gold light of evening. The Type 95 followed behind, its smaller tires turning like clockwork, unhurried but unyielding. The test took hours. When the vehicles returned, headlights piercing the dusk, Hayes could tell the difference without touching a gauge. The Jeep's hood shimmered with heat. The Type 95 was cool enough to touch. Hayes placed his hand on its fender. The metal was warm, alive, but steady. No rattles, no smoke, just a low hum that faded into silence as Dalton shut off the ignition. The engineers gathered around, their faces marked by equal parts curiosity and disbelief. Ramirez broke the quiet first. "Sir, I don't get it. How's that thing still purring after all of this?" Hayes didn't reply right away. He stared at the small machine, at the simplicity of its design. The answer was there, somewhere between logic and humility.
Good engineering, mostly.
"They built it to survive," he said finally, "not to impress." For the first time, the laughter that had greeted the Type 95 2 days earlier was gone. What remained was respect. A reluctant, uneasy respect, born not of defeat, but of revelation. The engineers packed their tools as the last light faded. Hayes lingered, jotting a note in his ledger. Performance moderate, efficiency exceptional, potential lessons significant. He looked up at the darkening sky. In that moment, the test field no longer felt like Maryland. It felt like a battlefield, one where ideas fought harder than armies. He turned toward the bay where the vehicles would rest overnight and called out to his team, "Tomorrow, we're opening its untold maintenance kit. Let's see what kind of mind builds a machine like this." And as the wind swept across the field, carrying the faint scent of oil and earth, Hayes couldn't shake the thought echoing in his mind. If something this small could endure the impossible, what else might it teach them? The next morning, the hangar doors creaked open before sunrise. The Type 95 sat exactly where they'd left it, a thin layer of dew tracing silver veins across its olive-green paint. Captain Robert Hayes walked slowly toward it, his breath misting in the cold air, and for the first time, he felt something almost like reverence. The day before had proven what the machine could do. Today, he wanted to know why. Sergeant Leo Ramirez and Engineer Frank Dalton were already at work, laying out the captured maintenance kit, a simple canvas roll tied with string. Hayes knelt beside it as Ramirez unrolled the fabric. 16 tools. No more. Each one fitted perfectly into its place, worn smooth from use but immaculately clean. Dalton frowned. "That's it? 16? Hayes nodded slowly. "That's all they needed." He picked up a small wrench, its edge engraved with faint Japanese markings. The balance was perfect. Not the mass-produced kind of tool that came from Detroit, but something handmade, functional, enduring. He glanced at the maintenance manual beside it, its pages yellowed and stiff. Unlike the thick technical binders that accompanied American equipment, this booklet was short, 42 pages, written in simple diagrams and instructions that even a farmhand could follow. "They wrote it for soldiers," Hayes murmured, flipping a page. "Not for mechanics." Ramirez leaned in. Sir, you think the guys who built this ever saw a factory floor? Hayes shook his head. I think they built it on one. He studied the illustrations, an exploded view of the transmission, notes about how to field strip the carburetor using only a bayonet for leverage, diagrams showing how to file replacement parts from salvaged metal. The logic was flawless, almost poetic in its simplicity. They had anticipated failure, and instead of fearing it, they had engineered around it. Dalton ran a hand across the engine bay. Look at this layout. No water pump, no radiator, air-cooled. No hoses to burst, no coolant to leak. You could drive this thing in the middle of nowhere, and it'd still keep running. Hayes flipped back to the first page of the manual. A line of text, translated in pencil by the intelligence team, caught his eye. When the soldier cannot return to base, the vehicle must become the base. He read it again under his breath. That single sentence, he realized, carried the weight of Japan's entire war. The Type 95 wasn't designed for victory. It was designed for survival. Ramirez examined the gear lever. Sir, check this out. It's not the usual pattern. Feels sequential, like a motorcycle. Hayes climbed into the driver's seat, his knees again brushing the dash. He moved the shifter, forward, back, forward again. No clutch between gears. Smooth mechanical clicks. Ingenious. They adapted what they already knew, he said. Motorcycle transmission, aircraft cooling, everything they had, reimagined for war. It was more than resourcefulness. It was philosophy turned into engineering. Where the American design focused on dominance, the Japanese design focused on continuity. A machine that could survive when nothing else could. As the morning light climbed through the hangar windows, Hayes' understanding deepened. He thought about the numbers he'd seen in the intelligence files. 18,000 tons of aluminum produced by Japan in 1942, barely enough to build a handful of planes a month. America consumed that much metal every few weeks. Steel, rubber, copper. Every material the USS had in excess, Japan rationed to the ounce. Yet from those limitations had come something that refused to die. He felt a strange mix of admiration and discomfort. If necessity truly was the mother of invention, then this vehicle was proof of what desperation could achieve. Ramirez wiped grease from his hands. Captain, I gotta say, this thing's got more heart than half the stuff we make back home. Hayes smiled faintly. It's not heart, he said. It's humility. They built around what they didn't have. He stood and looked at the Type 95 one last time before calling it a day's work. The air in the hangar was thick with quiet understanding, the kind that comes when discovery humbles pride. The more Hayes learned, the more the machine seemed less like an artifact of war and more like a message from it. Every bolt, every line of its manual whispered the same truth. Brilliance isn't born from abundance. It's forged in constraint. As the sun dipped low over Aberdeen, Hayes closed the manual and set it gently on the hood. For a moment, he imagined the unknown engineers who had written it, working by candlelight in a factory half a world away, knowing that their creation might never bring them victory, but might help a soldier come home alive. He felt a pang of respect for their discipline, for their clarity, for their quiet genius, and as the hangar lights flickered off, he found himself wondering something that few American officers ever dared to ask. Had the United States become so powerful that it had forgotten how to be clever? For Captain Robert Hayes, that question refused to fade. Over the next several weeks, he poured his findings into a formal assessment. 48 pages of data, diagrams, and quiet revelations. He wrote not as a patriot defending his nation's pride, but as an engineer chasing the truth. The conclusion was simple, almost heretical. The Japanese Type 95 was not inferior. It was adapted. Every sentence of the report chipped away at a belief that had seemed untouchable since Pearl Harbor, that American engineering, by virtue of its scale, was automatically the best in the world. Hayes described how the Type 95's air-cooled engine could run indefinitely without a drop of coolant, how its simple carburetor worked at impossible angles, how its modular parts could be replaced by hand using tools carried in a soldier's backpack. He ended his report with a line that summed up everything he had learned. They designed for scarcity. We designed for certainty. And certainty in war is the first illusion to die. When he finished typing, he removed his cap, exhaled slowly, and read it back to himself in the silence of his office. It didn't sound like a military document. It sounded like a confession. The next morning, Hayes carried the report to the headquarters briefing room, where Major Stephen Wallace, the regional ordnance chief, waited behind a polished desk. Wallace was everything Hayes wasn't: impeccably dressed, rigid, and certain of his own logic. As Hayes began his presentation, Wallace skimmed the pages, his expression unreadable. "So," he said after a long pause, "you're telling me this Japanese toy is better than our Jeep?" Hayes shook his head. "Not better, sir. Smarter. Built for conditions where ours wouldn't last a week." Wallace frowned. "Can it carry an 800-pound load?" Hayes hesitated. "No, sir." "Then it's not relevant," Wallace interrupted, sliding the report aside. "We're not in the business of learning from failure. We're in the business of winning." Hayes wanted to argue, but he stopped himself. The words would only vanish into the same machine that produced endless memos and circular orders. He collected his papers, saluted, and left the office without another word. Outside, the winter air stung his face, sharp and unforgiving. That night, he wrote in his personal notebook, not for the army, but for himself. "Maybe learning from your enemy isn't weakness," he wrote. "Maybe it's survival." Weeks passed. New shipments arrived from the Pacific: tanks, rifles, radios, but the small Type 95 remained in its corner of the hangar, unclaimed and uncelebrated. Then, early in 1944, something changed. Reports began to arrive from Burma and the Philippines, American South, convoys stranded in mud, engines overheated, radiators ruptured. Field officers complained that their jeeps were failing faster than replacements could be shipped. Someone in Washington remembered Hayes's report. Within days, copies of it were circulated across the Pacific Command. His quiet observations had suddenly become a blueprint for solutions. At Aberdeen, Hayes received a cable stamped "Urgent." The brass wanted additional tests on lightweight suspension systems, simplified transmissions, and air cooling concepts, all lessons drawn directly from the Japanese design he had been told to forget. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt sobered. War had a way of humbling even the most confident engineers. One afternoon, as snow began to fall outside the testing bay, Hayes stood before the Type 95 again. The little machine seemed almost alive beneath the dust, a relic that had outsmarted its captors by simply refusing to die. Ramirez walked in, holding a mug of coffee, and glanced at the report Hayes had laid on the hood. "They finally read it, huh?" he asked. Hayes nodded. "Took them long enough." Ramirez smiled faintly. "Guess they figured out power ain't everything." Hayes looked at him, then back at the small vehicle. "No," he said softly, "but endurance might just win the war." That night, he rewrote the final line of his report before resubmitting it. The Japanese did not build weakness. They built wisdom within limits. If we fail to recognize that, we risk repeating their mistakes under a different flag. For weeks after, Hayes continued his work in silence, his analysis spreading quietly through the engineering corps. In time, he would hear that his recommendations had reached Detroit, where new prototypes were being drafted with fewer parts, simpler designs, and field-ready maintenance.
Can it maintain structural?
Yet none of that erased the uneasy truth that haunted him. The lessons of the Type 95 were not about machines. They were about men. When nations believed they could not fail, they stopped learning how to survive. Hayes stood in the hangar doorway one evening, the snow outside glowing faintly under the lamps. The Japanese car sat motionless, its hood still open from the last inspection. Somewhere beyond the horizon, thousands of jeeps rolled toward the next battle, engines roaring, fueled by victory and certainty. But he knew that out there, in some forgotten clearing or mountain trail, a handful of Japanese vehicles were still running, carrying soldiers who had long since run out of hope, but not of ingenuity. As the wind swept through the bay, rustling the papers on his desk, Hayes wondered what the next generation of engineers would remember: the power of their machines, or the wisdom of their adversaries. And before the war ended, he was about to see proof that America had learned, and that would make all the difference. By the spring of 1944, the tone at Aberdeen Proving Ground had changed. The war had turned in the Allies' favor, yet behind the noise of victory, quiet revolutions were taking shape in the workshops. Captain Robert Hayes found himself summoned to a new division, experimental vehicle development, where engineers were testing prototypes that looked strikingly familiar. On the drafting tables lay blueprints marked with phrases he recognized from his own report: simplified suspension, air-cooled power plant, field serviceable transmission. The lessons born from the Type 95 had found their way into American hands. Standing at the edge of the testing bay, Hayes watched a small olive-drab prototype roll by. It was heavier than the Japanese design, more muscular, but beneath the surface lay a subtle shift in philosophy. It was built not just for power, but for resilience. The mechanic at the wheel looked up and grinned. "Runs cooler, sir, and if something breaks, we can fix it right here." Hayes smiled faintly. The sentence could have been lifted straight from the Japanese manual. The war had forced the United States to adapt, not because it had to, but because it was finally wise enough to see value in simplicity. Weeks later, a memorandum from Detroit arrived on Hayes's desk. It came from a project called MUT, the Military Utility Tactical Truck. It spoke of independent suspension, lightweight frame design, and quick field maintenance. Reading the words, Hayes felt a rare sense of closure. The little Japanese machine that everyone had once laughed at had quietly rewritten the standards of American design. It wasn't an admission of defeat. It was the evolution of understanding. He remembered Ramirez's words months earlier. "Power ain't everything." He had been right. In an industrial war measured in tons of steel and gallons of gasoline, the greatest victory had come from an idea small enough to fit inside a .33 power engine. As summer turned to autumn, news of Allied advances filled the radio. The Pacific campaign accelerated, islands changing hands one by one. Reports from the field confirmed what Hayes already suspected. American mechanics were improvising faster, fixing longer, learning to repair with fewer tools and fewer assumptions. Somewhere within that transformation, he saw the fingerprints of the Type 95. One afternoon, he visited the museum annex at Aberdeen, where the captured vehicles were being cataloged. In the center of the floor sat the same Japanese car, its olive paint now dulled by dust, but its presence unchanged. Hayes ran a hand across the fender and smiled. "You did your job," Hikofunku murmured, "more than anyone ever thought you would." For a moment, he imagined its creators, engineers in Tokyo, working by lantern light, unaware that their modest design would one day influence the very army that had defeated them. War had divided nations, but knowledge, he realized, had no allegiance. It only waited for those humble enough to listen. That evening, As the sun set behind the Maryland hills, Hayes sat at his desk, drafting a closing statement for the Ordnance Board. His handwriting was deliberate, steady. Victory is not measured by what we destroy, but by what we understand. The Type 95 taught us that ingenuity born of necessity can outlast power born of plenty. He sealed the envelope and leaned back, feeling a calm that had eluded him for years. Beyond the walls of Aberdeen, the world was rebuilding, but in that small corner of it, something deeper had shifted. America had not just built better machines, it had built better wisdom. Decades later, when the first Humvees rolled out of factories across the country, Hayes would be an old man reading about them in the morning paper. He would notice the familiar phrases, air-cooled prototypes, simplified maintenance systems, and smile quietly to himself. Progress, he knew, was never born from arrogance. It came from respect, even for one's enemies. The war had ended long ago, but the lesson remained timeless. Sometimes the future is built not by those who shout the loudest, but by those who take the time to listen. And as Hayes stepped outside into the cool night, the stars reflected faintly off the hood of the Type 95, parked beside a row of American vehicles. 2 nations, 2 machines, 1 shared truth. Victory wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of understanding. Because sometimes, realizing how far ahead you are begins with respecting those who kept up with so little.